Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Today we will have Morganne Foley from the McInnes Cooper law firm. Thank you so much, Morganne, for making that happen. Morganne is a partner in McInnes Cooper St. John office with a practice specializing in immigration and corporate law. So Morganne, it's yours now.
Great. Thank you very much, Doa. I am sharing my screen, so hopefully everyone can see that, and you'll notice it's myself as well as my colleague Caitlin Gamble on our first slide here, so everyone hopefully can see Caitlin. Some of you may know Caitlin from various efforts helping out at the Newcomer Center already, but if you haven't met her, Caitlin is on the line as well and helps me with many things immigration related. So I think probably the best approach in terms of questions, I want to make sure that I leave time for questions, especially where I'm sharing my screen. I can't see everyone at the same time. So I think if you can make note of your questions, we'll save some time at the end. I do have some questions also that Doa has sent to me in advance. So I'm going to try to either incorporate the answers to some frequently asked questions into the presentation or address them specifically at the end. But if your question isn't answered by the time we are done with sort of the more formal part, then I encourage you to ask any questions at the end of the session. And it's a lot of information to cover, right? We've set aside an hour over the lunch hour. Certainly, I could talk for many hours on all of the various topics that we're going to touch on today. So it's really intended to be a bit of an overview, hopefully clarify some of those frequently asked questions, and with a primary focus on what pathways to permanent residency exist in Canada, mainly for work permit holders, but not exclusively those who already hold work permits. And, keep in mind, of course, I always tell all of my clients and everyone I meet with, everyone's immigration process is a little bit different. You could be, someone with the same job offer, working in the same location with the same work permit from the same country, and you still might experience your pathway to PR or citizenship a little bit differently than your neighbor down the hall who's doing the same work, just by virtue of your own personal circumstances, the changes in processing times and things that fluctuate with the immigration process. So as I mentioned, it's going to be an overview today. We can't address everyone's individual particular circumstances. I'll do my best in terms of answering questions, but if you can try to keep your questions a little more general and not super fact specific, we won't be able to address each individual person. With all of that said, I'm more than happy to meet with people individually post this presentation today. My contact information is readily available on the slides, and Doa has that as well. So certainly encourage anyone to reach out. So with all of that bit of preamble, I will jump right in here. So obviously, as I mentioned, we're here to talk today, at least in some part, about how to remain in Canada, how to apply for permanent residency. We'll talk specifically about provincial options as well, so options in New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada. And just a little bit of background, you'll hear lots of various terms. You'll probably be familiar with many, if not all, of the terms and abbreviations that we use as we discuss the various pathways to PR today. But here are just a couple of key ones that you'll see coming up over and over again. If you're not familiar, the Education Credential Assessment, that's a document that you have to verify your foreign education. So it'll give you the equivalency of your foreign education as it relates to Canadian education. The CLB, or Canadian Language Benchmark, is a level of language ability, either English or French, and each program has a level that is the minimum requirement for English ability. When we're talking about English, it's the IELTS, the CELPIP, or this new Pearson Canada test that you can write. There are also French language tests, the TCF, TEF, that are available to demonstrate French language ability, if that is the language that you're more comfortable with. And then the NOC codes, or National Occupation Classification. So you'll see reference to NOC codes. You'll also see reference to tiers, which we'll address on the next slide. And this is when we're referring to your work, either your work experience or the offer of employment that you might have if you're going through an economic pathway to permanent residency. So a pathway that is related to your work experience or your ability to work in Canada. And I should note that we're going to focus on those economic pathways as part of this presentation today. So there are family class applications for permanent residency where you might sponsor a family member. If you are a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, you're sponsoring a foreign national. There are refugee pathways to permanent residency. So we aren't focusing on either of those here today. This is more so for an audience who is going a work permit route to PR. As I noted in connection with the NOC codes, there are various tier levels. These denote the skill level associated with the occupation. So all of the NOCs are classified into one of the 6 available tiers, right? Going from 0 to 5. And you can kind of see on this chart here on the slide, the 5 being the lowest skill level, where formal education really isn't required. It's mainly on the job training that would be all that's required for the job, right up to tier 1 being professional jobs. Typically post-secondary education is required, and 0 being those management and executive level positions. When we're talking about high versus low skilled work experience or job offers, which you'll see throughout some of the slides here today, you'll see high skilled being tiers 0 to 3. So 0, 1, 2, and 3 are all classified as high skilled. 4 and 5 are low skilled tiers. So hopefully that just sets the stage a little bit for some of the terminology you'll hear today. I'm going to try to touch on everything you see here on the screen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Federal Express Entry to get started. We won't dive into startup visas. I just note those on this screen here as another federal program to permanent residency. That's really for programs of self-employment where you have a designated institution in Canada that is giving support to your startup business. So that's really kind of a unique path on its own. And certainly if that's something that you think is relevant, we could talk about that separately. We'll talk about the Atlantic Immigration Program, and we'll also talk about the New Brunswick Provincial Nominee Program. So when we're talking about Express Entry, there are numerous categories within the Federal Express Entry program. So Express Entry is an online system that manages these 3 different categories of permanent residency applications: Canadian Experience Class, Federal Skilled Worker, and Federal Skilled Trades. They are fairly self-explanatory in terms of their titles. The Canadian Experience Class, you only qualify if you do in fact have Canadian work experience. Federal Skilled Worker, you can qualify whether your work experience is foreign work experience outside of Canada or Canadian work experience. And then Federal Skilled Trades is relevant if your work experience is in a trade. These, when we talk about Express Entry, they're all relevant for high skilled work experience. So we're talking about experience that you have that are in those high skilled tiers and NOC codes. So in general, if you're going through the Express Entry process, you have some work experience already, whether that's in Canada because you have a work permit or it's outside of Canada. A person could apply from outside of Canada before they've ever even been to Canada, technically, if they're relying on their foreign work experience exclusively. They may have a combination of foreign and Canadian work experience. And this is something that you might be relevant in a case where you are on a work permit initially. Maybe that's based on an LMIA. Maybe it is an open work permit, like a postgraduate work permit. you've accumulated at least a year of Canadian work experience. Now you're looking to transition to permanent residency. If that work experience is high skilled and you have worked at least a year in Canada or outside of Canada, then maybe you qualify to create an express entry profile. The express entry program is not dependent on the employer in the sense that the job offer in Canada is not mandatory. Now there is options for gaining additional points and things under express entry if you do happen to have that job offer, but it is not mandatory, whereas some of the other pathways that we'll talk about today are employer driven and require that offer of employment. So very briefly, express entry, it's an online points-based system. So you're gaining points in an online profile for things like your age, your level of education. If you happen to have Canadian education, that's worth points as well. Your language ability in English or French or both, and your work experience. If you are married or in a common law relationship, you can also achieve points for your spouse's language ability, if they have Canadian work experience, and if they have education. That can also help boost your score by including them in your profile. So you create this online profile. If you meet those baseline criteria, you are given a point score. You're ranked amongst everyone who has a profile in the express entry pool. And then every so often, generally at least once a month, although we tend to see it more frequently, the federal government will give invitations to apply to those who are at that minimum threshold for a particular draw from the federal pool. So there are a number of different draws that can take place, but let's just say, you know, they're doing a general draw. So everyone in the pool is eligible, and they've determined that the cutoff score is 500 for that particular draw. If you're in the pool and your score is above 500, then you would get an invitation to apply. And with that invitation, you can apply for permanent residency. You have 60 days from the time that you're invited to submit your full PR application. If you need to extend your stay, you're eligible for a bridging open work permit. I'm going to talk more about open work permits and extending work permits in general, but just to note as part of the express entry process that the bridging open work permit is an option. And generally speaking, the processing time once you've filed the application for express entry is about 6 months processing to the time that you would get your permanent residency approved. So just a little overview, take note of some of the kind of baseline criteria in terms of creating a profile. If you're looking to apply under the Canadian experience class, as I noted, a minimum of a year or more of full-time work experience in Canada within the last 3 years in one of those high skilled tiers. The language ability, the minimum threshold is based on the level of the tier. So you can see there CLB 7 if it's tier 0 or 1, CLB 5 if tier 2 or 3. There is no minimum education requirement, but keep in mind these are the minimum thresholds. You will achieve higher points for having higher language scores, higher education, having a job offer, etc. If we compare that with the federal skilled worker, which you'll recall, Canadian work experience is not mandatory. This could be a case where you only have foreign work experience. There is a grid of eligibility where you have to achieve at least 67 of 100 points to even create a profile. You have to have, again, 1 year of full-time work experience. Now, this could be, and this was one of the questions that came up in relation to, I think, one of the provincial programs, but it could be a combination of part-time and full-time work experience, and it could be a combination of work experience with multiple employers, but they should be still in that high skill level and should be related to your current employment. But let's just say, for example, that someone is working as a software developer and they spend 6 months working with company A, and then they spend 6 months working with company B, and it was full-time, so 30 or more hours a week with both companies. They could input that experience, even though it's not 1 year with one employer, and together that would count as 1 year of work experience to qualify and express entry. That's true of other programs as well, where you have to demonstrate a minimum level of experience. You can use multiple employers if necessary, or combine hours of multiple part-time jobs to equate for a full-time job, for example. Language minimum of CLB 7, minimum of secondary school education, and again, job offer, not mandatory, but does give additional points under federal skilled worker. If you're applying from outside of Canada, proof of funds is also required, but if you're inside Canada, if you're applying under Canadian experience class, or if you're working on a work permit, then the proof of funds are not required. So it'll depend on your personal circumstances there. So then we're going to just jump to the provincial nominee program and talk about the New Brunswick PNP. So the New Brunswick Provincial Nominee Program is a program that is a two-part application. You're applying first to the provincial authority for nomination for permanent residency. And then once you are nominated, you're submitting the federal portion of your application to IRCC for your permanent residence. So it happens in 2 stages. And in order to apply at the provincial level first to become nominated, there are a number of subcategories under which you might apply. So you'll see here we've kind of broken it out as a worker, so someone who either has a job offer or is working on a work permit in Canada. You're looking at the skilled worker stream, the express entry stream, or the strategic initiative program, which is a francophone program. As an entrepreneur, and again, we're not really getting too much into the self-employed routes in this presentation today, but just so you're aware, as an entrepreneur, there is a New Brunswick business immigration stream where you would apply based on the either purchase of a business or the establishment of a new business in New Brunswick. Then if we look again at the express entry stream, it also breaks itself into the types of connections you can demonstrate to the province in order to be eligible for the New Brunswick express entry stream. So let's just try to get into those in a little bit more detail here, hopefully make that a little more clear. The skilled worker stream under the provincial nominee program is an application where you have an employer who is supporting you for permanent residence, meaning you have a full-time offer of employment, unconditional, meaning it has no predetermined end date. You know, it's not a 1-year contract, but it's a full-time permanent offer of employment from an eligible New Brunswick employer. One of the questions that came up in advance too was, you know, can this be an employer who is outside of the province? And no, it has to be an employer that has a physical location actually inside the province. And that's true for the AIP, which we'll talk about, and the PNP. So in this case, you have an employer, they're willing to support your permanent residency application by confirming your job offer, and you meet the other basic elements of the program, which are on the screen here. So minimum education of either Canadian high school, secondary school, or a foreign high school diploma, which is where that ECA comes into play, having that equivalency assessment to demonstrate that your education is equal to, at minimum, a Canadian high school level of education. A minimum of 1 year of related work experience within the last 5 years. So again, it should be related to the offer that your current New Brunswick employer is making to you. That might be a year that you've gained working for that employer already, if you have a work permit for them already, or it might be work that you've gained with another employer in Canada or an employer outside of Canada. The skill level of the job offer from the employer should be at least equivalent to your related work experience or higher. Then your language, a minimum level of CLB 4 for English and 4 for French as well. There is an age restriction for the PNP program, so you have to be between 19 and 55 in order to apply for one of the PNP programs. That's a question that came up as well in terms of, if you're over 55, what options are available to you? Well, the express entry does not have an age limit. However, you may recall I noted you get points based on your age. So once you are over 40, those points drop off. You don't get any points for age anymore, so your score can become a bit less competitive than express entry. Atlantic Immigration Program, the AIP, there's no age restriction as well, and it operates more closely to the PNP. So that's probably a better option for you and your employer to consider if you are outside of this age eligibility here. Job offer, we mentioned, genuine intention to reside in New Brunswick. So that's kind of a key element of the New Brunswick Provincial Nominee Program, regardless of the various streams underneath that program. They all have this need for you to demonstrate that you intend to reside in New Brunswick and remain employed with the employer that's supporting you. So, if you are currently in New Brunswick, but you know that you're going to be moving outside of the province, in the immediate future, well, then the PNP is not likely going to be the best option for you because you don't have that intention to reside in the province. There is an employer information form that has to be completed as well. The key thing to note there is that it's an employer supported application. So the employer has to be on board with applying and completing this form for you. New Brunswick PNP Express Entry. So this is a joint or hybrid program with the federal express entry that we've already talked about here today. So at the federal level, it's that express entry profile. It's based on your point score, and it's not linked to any province in particular. At the provincial level, the province has the ability to nominate a candidate that has that intention to settle in the province. And the nomination that you gain from an express entry stream actually gives you additional points that you can then add to your federal profile. You go back to the federal pool with a higher point score, increasing your likelihood of getting an invitation to apply, and then going through the express entry pathway once invited to apply for your PR. So these are the various categories in which you might get nominated by the province to then boost that express entry score. In order to be eligible to even seek that nomination under express entry from the province, you have to have one of these 3 connections to the province. So you could have an employment connection where you've been residing in New Brunswick for at least 6 months and are currently working, or you have a full-time job offer from a New Brunswick employer. It's not an employer supported pathway the way the skilled worker one is that we were just discussing, but rather it is the fact that you are working in New Brunswick alone that gives you that employment connection. Compare that with the student connection. So if you're an international student who's graduating from a New Brunswick designated learning institution, that's what that DLI stands for, and you're in school in a postgrad work permit eligible program, then you may be eligible to apply based on that student connection. So if you've completed your studies within the past 6 months and you're currently living in New Brunswick, or if you're enrolled as a graduate student, a master's or PhD student in New Brunswick. And then the final category here, the priorities connection. So the province can indicate particular in-demand knock codes that they want to invite people to apply under the express entry, or if you have one of the 3 items noted in this first bubble here, you or your spouse has a close family member in New Brunswick who's a citizen or permanent resident, and they've been living there for more than 12 months. If you've attended an international recruitment event, or if it is a francophone occupation in an in-demand sector. So those priority connections are kind of always evolving. And if you're looking on the New Brunswick PNP website, they will post updates as they become available in terms of what they are considering priority sectors at any particular given time. So again, we touched on this on the slides, but in terms of the education requirements under the employer connection or the priorities connection, it's graduation from Canadian institution or a foreign institution where you have an ECA. The student connection requires that New Brunswick education in order to demonstrate that connection. Also, just touching here a bit on the postgraduate work permit. So some of you may be open postgraduate work permit holders, or if you are students who are currently studying and are enrolled in a postgraduate work permit eligible program, then the postgraduate work permit, once you have completed your studies and you've received that confirmation that you've completed your studies, then you're permitted to apply for the postgrad work permit, which will give you an open work permit to then gain your hopefully skilled work experience such that it might support a permanent residency application. So when we're talking about potential open work permits, this is one. And this is maybe a good point in the presentation for me to touch a little more generally on open work permits as well. I don't have a slide per se. But some of the questions that we received were with respect to obtaining open work permits or changing from a closed work permit to an open work permit. So I think it's important to understand that the open work permit is fairly limited in terms of its availability. So it's limited to particular circumstances, and it's not something that you can just identify. I would prefer to have an open work permit and therefore I'm going to apply for one. You have to have a basis for making the open work permit application. And so, most commonly what we see in terms of open work permits, the postgrad work permit, which we just discussed, would be one of the most common. So for students who are graduating in Canada, then transitioning to the postgrad work permit, that's an open work permit of up to 3 years in duration, depending on the duration of your studies. Another really common open work permit would be for accompanying family members. So if a spouse, for example, is here as a student or with a closed work permit, their spouse is eligible to accompany them to Canada and would be eligible for an open work permit. So while the primary spouse is working on a closed work permit or is studying, then the accompanying spouse has that open work permit to come stay with them in Canada and work with any employer. There are particular circumstances where an in-Canada refugee applicant would be eligible potentially for an open work permit. There are public policies that exist. Most recently, the program for Ukrainians where they were eligible to apply for a 3-year open work permit is a good example of something that is from a change to policy created to address a specific need. So there are instances like that where an open work permit becomes available. But generally speaking, you have to have one of those factors in order to change from a closed work permit to an open work permit, or even to extend an open work permit, for example. The bridging open work permit we referenced in one of the initial slides with respect to express entry. So the bridging open work permit is intended for permanent residency applicants who have submitted their PR application and are awaiting a decision on the PR application, and they need to extend their work permit in order to remain in Canada and continue working while they're waiting on that decision. We see it most commonly for someone who has applied under express entry. It's important to note that if you are applying as a provincial nominee, if your nomination is restricted in any way, and most of the time for the employer-supported pathways, you'll see that it is restricted to the employer that's supporting you, then it's not the bridging open work permit that's relevant for you because of that restriction. Now, in the case of a nominee, you're able to obtain a nomination-based work permit. So you can get a letter of support from the province based on your nomination and extend your work permit that way. So just want to make sure, of course, that you're getting the right advice and you're making the correct work permit application to extend your stay. And that's an important thing to note as well. When you're making a permanent residency application, the fact alone that you've applied for PR does not extend your temporary resident status. So you are still required to maintain valid temporary status until you have the confirmation of PR. So if your work permit is going to expire before there's a decision on your PR or your study permit or your visitor status, any of those temporary statuses are going to expire, you need to take steps to extend those and not just rely on the fact that you have a PR application in process. And that's sometimes where people can get tripped up and accidentally fall out of status while they're waiting on their permanent residency. So just jumping, it's just the same eligibility in terms of the PNP, but the strategic initiative we had touched on in the initial slide of the PNP, as I noted, that's a Francophone initiative. So for individuals who are settling in New Brunswick and have French language ability. So you'll see the language minimum requirement there for a French language test, same age requirements, same minimum education requirements, and then again, a qualifying connection to New Brunswick, being either an exploratory visit, a job or genuine job offer, or a direct invitation from the province. So in some instances, the province will issue invitations for people to apply under the strategic initiative. Right now, they are paused, so they aren't issuing invitations at all under the strategic initiative, but it is due to reopen according to their website in early 2024, which is where we are right now. So again, it's the kind of thing where stay tuned. We may see an update in the near future on that. And then again, just touching briefly, I noted the business immigration stream as well. So this is the self-employment group, slightly higher age range, so 21 to 59 under the business immigration stream. And this is the case where you intend to reside in New Brunswick and are going to either purchase a business or operate a new business. You'll go through a process with the province to demonstrate your business plan. If they then wish to invite you based on that business plan, that would kind of start the process for your work permit as well as permanent residency. And there is a minimum net worth requirement as well, as you'll see on the screen, of greater than $500,000. So not getting too much into detail there, but this is just kind of your basic requirements if you are looking at the business. And then from our main screen here, you'll recall the Atlantic Immigration Program as another one of the pathways to permanent residency that we want to discuss today. The AIP, like I said, it operates similarly to the PNP in that it is a two-stage process. So there is an application initially to the province, and then once you are, in this case, endorsed by the province, you'd then be eligible to apply at the federal level to IRCC for your permanent residency. And in this case, the process has kind of an extra step at the beginning because the AIP requires the employer to be designated under the program before they can then support your application. In this case, it might be that you have an employer who is already designated. Some employers have become designated because they have previously supported employees or because they know, just as part of their workforce planning, they know that they have a particular number of individuals that they expect to support under the AIP. Or it may be that you're working for an employer who's not yet designated, but is eligible to become designated. And as part of their willingness to support your own permanent residency application, they may then become designated. So in this case, whether the employer is already designated or then becomes designated, once they are designated, you can move to your provincial application. So you as the applicant are required to obtain a settlement plan. And this is partly because the AIP is intended to be an employer-driven program and is also designed with the hopes of increasing settlement and retention in the Atlantic Canadian provinces. So it was kind of developed in response to the fact that we would see many newcomers might come to Atlantic Canada, but then if we looked out, 3-5 years down the road, we saw that we had a lower retention rate. More people were leaving the province than what we saw in other provinces across Canada. So in an attempt to address this, they created the AIP for the 4 Atlantic provinces. And part of the driving factor behind that is by identifying settlement needs on the front end, hopefully we can help newcomers to determine what it is that they need from the province to better settle and actually want to remain in the province that has endorsed them. So that's the rationale behind the settlement plan. You would obtain that with a local newcomer agency in order to determine what is it that you need. Maybe it's English classes for yourself or your family. Maybe you need help finding a family doctor or opening bank accounts. It could be any number of things that they have identified as a need for the individual applicant. And then the employer is committing to assist with the needs that have been identified in the settlement plan. Once that is complete, you can submit the endorsement application to the province. When you're endorsed by the province, at that stage, if you don't already have a work permit that allows you to work for the employer that's supporting you, you can make an AIP work permit application. And then you can also, with the certificate of endorsement, submit your federal PR application. And right now we're seeing approximately 6 months for processing time at the federal level. So after you've been endorsed and you apply to IRCC for PR, approximately 6 months of processing before there's a decision. So I talked a bit about the employer eligibility and what is required for an employer to become designated if they aren't already. So they need to be looking to hire full-time, non-seasonal employees. So this is full-time work. They have to operate an established business that's in good standing, so they can't be in default of any immigration requirements or even provincial employer requirements. They have to have been in operation under their current management for a minimum of 2 years as well. So it can't be a brand new employer that has just started operating. They have to meet some of these baseline establishment criteria. And again, like I noted with the settlement plan, the employer has to be committed to meeting the settlement needs of the international candidates and accompanying family members. So being willing to agree to the supports that are necessary in that settlement plan. There's also mandatory training that the employer has to go through at the beginning when they're going through the designation process in order to understand the program and also to do some cultural competency training as well. All of this with the intention of having the employers prepared to help the settlement needs of their international employees. It is an LMIA exempt program, meaning their employer is not required to obtain an LMIA. We haven't really talked about LMIAs, but for anyone who is not familiar, the LMIA is a labor market impact assessment. So that's something that the employer kind of as a baseline work permit criteria. If you're not eligible for one of the various exemptions, and everything we've talked about here today has really been one of those exemptions, then the employer would need an LMIA in order to employ someone, in order to obtain a work permit for them. And so this could be the case where someone is maybe already on an LMIA supported work permit and then is looking to transition to PR, and they've gained their qualifying work experience, etc. In terms of the individual applicants' eligibility, so if you look here, there are the tier levels of the job, so the skill level of the job do play a factor in terms of what the minimum eligibility requirements for the applicant are. So if we look at education, if the job offer is in those higher skilled 0 and 1, then there's a minimum of 1 year post-secondary education that's required. It could be Canadian education or it could be foreign education within ECA. If it's tiers 2, 3, and 4, then a high school, either Canadian or foreign education, is required. Note that the AIP is only eligible for tiers 0 to 4. So if you're in a tier 5 position, then you're not eligible for the AIP, which is why you don't see reference to that tier here. The language also depends on the tier level. So for everything other than tier 4, a CLB 5 is the minimum. Tier 4, a CLB 4 is the minimum. Settlement plan, as we discussed. Work experience. So in order to apply under the AIP, you have to have 1 year, again, of full-time work experience. Full-time is 30 hours or more per week within the last 5 years. The only exception there is if you are an Atlantic Canadian graduate. So within the last 2 years, if you've graduated from a post-secondary institution in Atlantic Canada for a program of study that was at least 2 years, then you are eligible to apply without having to demonstrate related work experience. So theoretically, you could be someone who graduated last month and now has a job offer from an employer who is designated. You can start your AIP application right away, assuming you have language test results, etc., because you don't have to wait until you've accumulated that work experience. And then the job offer. So the job offer requirements, again, by tier. If it is a tier 4 position, it has to be a permanent offer of employment that the employer is giving you. So no predetermined end date, not a contract for a finite period of time. If it's a tier 0, 1, 2, or 3, so those higher tiers, then the job offer requirement is for at least 1 year after you obtain permanent residency. So it's not necessarily indefinite permanent offer, but it has to be for at least a year after you obtain PR, which can be a little tricky to calculate because you don't know necessarily the exact date on when you're going to obtain your PR, but the employer has to be committing to that employment for at least 1 year. And again, similar to express entry, proof of funds not required if you're currently working in Canada. If you're not yet in Canada or you're not working, then you would have to demonstrate a minimum level of funds that depend on your family size. So we're just going to get to questions here. I just wanted to touch before we hop to questions on misrepresentation as well. It's important that everyone understands what misrepresentation is. And I just like to give a little warning to make sure that you're aware of these requirements, because if you read anything in the news or you kind of keep up with current events at all, you probably see that unfortunately there is a lot of fraud when it comes to immigration and those who might act as immigration representatives, etc. And so it's important that you know that you are responsible for the information that is submitted as part of your application. And if you are found to have misrepresented yourself, so not been honest in a response to a question within an application, or failed to disclose something in an application, then whether that is something that you have submitted or that someone has submitted on your behalf, you would be held responsible. And it can, seriously impact your immigration application to the point where your application could be refused. You could face a fine, a ban of up to 5 years from Canada for having misrepresented yourself. So it is very serious. I don't say this to scare you, but I do say it just to caution you because, for example, here's a little clip from something that's been in the news fairly recently in terms of people who have unfortunately fallen victim to some of these kinds of scams that exist out there. So, when you're working with someone to help you with your application or when you're submitting the application yourself, this is really important to make sure that you're answering everything honestly, that you understand what's being asked of you, or if you don't, that you're seeking out help from the appropriate sources. And, you know, some of the things to keep in mind if you are working with representatives, for example, is that the only paid representatives that you can work with are either immigration lawyers, like myself, or immigration consultants who are registered RCIC consultants. Anyone else is not eligible to act as your paid representation with the IRCC. And, you know, things to kind of watch out for if someone is making promises that sound maybe too good to be true, right? They're guaranteeing you that something will be approved, or guaranteeing you a job, but maybe you have never spoken with the employer, things like that. Just be aware if something sounds too good to be true, that, you know, maybe it is, and you should be asking some additional questions. You know, if someone is submitting things on your behalf, but you've not reviewed them yourself, or you've not received any proof of submission, these are the kinds of things that unfortunately do happen. And when I'm in front of an audience like this, I do just like to take an opportunity to warn everyone that that is out there. And so to be careful when you are making these applications. So with that, again, I know it is a lot of information to squeeze into, well, 50 minutes or so. Hopefully not too overwhelming for everyone. But again, intended to really be an overview, hopefully answer a few questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, which I think I have now done, and bring up, I do have a few questions, like I said, that I was sent in advance. And some of them I think I've already answered, but I will just try to touch on a few others here if I can.
Yeah, thank you so much, Morgan. Yeah, I think we have many questions on the chat box too. I think there are like a couple of duplication between what we have in the chat box and what I sent you in advance. So let's start with what you have.
Sure. Yeah, okay. So let me just run through what I have here. So someone had asked if you are in the process of PR application through your spouse, but have a student visa, do you have to apply for the postgrad work permit, or how will your work permit be extended? So you might recall that I said the fact that you're applying for PR alone does not extend your status. You do have to extend your temporary status in some way. It doesn't mean that because you were a student, you are obligated to apply for the postgrad work permit. If you are eligible for a spousal open work permit because of your spouse, you could make that application instead. You could apply to change your status to that of a visitor. You know, there are a number of routes that you might go, again, based on your personal circumstances. The key thing is remaining in status, whether that is as a postgrad work permit holder, or a visitor, a worker, etc. And then, yeah, someone had asked about, you know, options for being over 55 years old. So hopefully that was addressed enough for you in the presentation itself. Transitioning from visitor visa to work permit. So historically, if you were inside Canada as a visitor, the requirement was to apply for a work permit from outside of Canada. You weren't permitted to apply to change to a worker from outside of Canada. Over COVID, some of the policies that were developed in response to COVID and travel restrictions, they've actually made it so that you are eligible to apply for a work permit from inside Canada as a visitor. That is still intended to be a temporary policy. However, they've been continually extending it, and you know, until we hear that it is no longer available, currently it is. So the key thing there is having a means to apply to the work permit, right? Again, you can't just say, well, I'm a visitor and I want a work permit. You have to have either an employer who is supporting the work permit application, or a job offer, at least. Maybe it's an LMIA that you need. You know, there are a variety of ways to transition to work permit, but the key is having that job offer. Okay, next question was about obligations under the AIP from the employer. So again, hopefully that was clarified in terms of the duration of the work job offer that is required. Someone had said, you know, I need to extend my status if I'm going through the PNP process. How long does that usually take? So, you know, if you look online, IRCC will actually publish the average processing times for almost all applications, including PR. If you just Google IRCC processing times, you'll be able to search by the type of application, whether it's PR or temporary residence. So for example, right now, inside Canada, a work permit application is taking approximately 3.5 months. So if you need to extend your work permit, that's about how long you can anticipate to get a decision. I don't have it right in front of me, but I think for visitor status, it's about the same, you know, 4 or 5 months to extend and get a decision on the extended visitor status right now, but that information is available. Someone had asked about whether or not it's required for the employer to be in New Brunswick for AIP and PNP. So yes, the employer has to have a physical location. Someone's asking how to get AIP employment. So, you know, again, it's really more about getting the job offer in general from an employer. You know, sometimes people will say, well, how can I make sure I'm getting an offer from an AIP employer? They do publish the list of designated employers, but in my experience, those designated employers are really inundated with applications from people who are seeking a job just because the employer is AIP designated. It's really better for you to obtain a job offer that's actually related to your skill set, you know, whether that's your work experience or your education, because the job offer should make sense for you and not just be the fact that it is AIP employment. From there, then you have the ability to see, you know, is this employer willing to support me under the AIP or the PNP? Might this work experience make me eligible for express entry, etc.? So I know it's easier said than done, but, you know, I would encourage you to seek employment that is related to your skills and your work experience in order to then make yourself eligible for permanent residency rather than the other way around. So yeah, someone had asked about changing employment. So you can use your work experience from a previous employer. Again, if it's related work experience in the same or higher skill level, you know, if it's full-time work experience, all of those things play a part of the consideration. But generally speaking, yes, your work experience can be from multiple employers. So let me see here. Again, a processing time question in terms of work permit expiring in September of 2024. So I guess one thing that's worth noting too is if you have a work permit currently and you're applying to extend your work permit, then as long as you submit your work permit application prior to the expiry of your current work permit. So let's just use some general numbers. If your current work permit expires on December 31st of this year, as long as you apply for a new work permit prior to December 31st, you know, the earlier, the better in terms of planning, but technically speaking, you could file it December 30th. I don't recommend leaving it to the very last minute like that, but, you know, technically, as long as it is filed with IRCC by December 30th, then you have what's referred to as maintained status as a worker. So you'll be eligible to continue working in Canada on the same conditions of your current work permit, and you're eligible to remain in Canada. So even though the processing time for a work permit is about 3.5 months right now, the key thing is making sure that you are applying in time to give yourself maintained status at the very least. Now, if you're on maintained status, you want to remain inside Canada before you, until you get a decision on that work permit, because if you are to leave Canada, you'd lose that maintained status. You'd need the new work permit before you could start working. And then I think the last one here from my list that I haven't addressed just yet is someone had a question with respect to the work permit having a clause at the bottom that says the work permit does not authorize re-entry. So an important thing to understand there is that the work permit itself is not a travel document. So the work permit is your authorization to work when you are inside Canada. But you still have to be eligible to travel to Canada. So I think the person asking was concerned whether that means that the work permit holder is not allowed to leave Canada. The key thing is you need to be able to enter Canada because you have either a passport and ETA if you're visa exempt, and the ETA is all you need to travel to Canada, or a temporary resident visa, a TRV, pasted in your passport if you are visa requiring. And so what happens sometimes is if you're extending your work permit from inside Canada, they don't automatically issue that TRV into your passport the way that they do when you're applying outside Canada. So you could be inside Canada with a valid work permit and the TRV pasted in your passport has expired. The work permit's valid, you have status in Canada, you can continue working. But if you were to leave and try to re-enter, just that work permit doesn't give you re-entry. You need that valid TRV in your passport as well. So you want to make sure you're planning accordingly. If you have travel, you can apply for a new TRV in your passport if you need one. And you want to be doing that before you travel, ideally, because generally speaking, the processing times outside Canada are going to be a lot longer. And if you found yourself outside of Canada without the valid TRV, then you are looking at a longer time before you can get a new one to return to Canada. I think that's it from my list, but I know I've seen the chat bubble going a little crazy here. So,
okay,
we're botting right up against time already, which I knew would happen, but I'll see just quickly, so if there's some that we can address.
Okay. So yeah, the first question here in the chat box is, how about self-employed experience overseas and Canada? Can I use it in express entry?
So you can use self-employed work experience outside of Canada in an express entry application. Self-employed experience inside Canada does not count as work experience in express entry.
Perfect. What happened if I was fired in LMIA program? What are the best paths to stay in Canada?
Yeah, so I'm assuming you have a work permit right now for an employer, but you're no longer working. You've been let go from that particular employer. So, you know, depending on when that work permit expires, you can remain in Canada and apply to change to a new work permit, right? But you have to qualify for a new work permit. So, you know, essentially you need a new offer from another employer who's willing to employ you and make a new work permit application from inside Canada so that you can get the new work permit you need to start working for a different employer.
Perfect. Can online work qualify for PR?
Yeah, so I guess I'm assuming you mean like, you know, remote work. You're working from home online. So it can qualify. You know, there are some particular circumstances there you probably want to talk about in a bit more detail in terms of who the employer is and where, you know, is it considered Canadian work? Just because you're in Canada, if the employer is outside of Canada, it wouldn't make it Canadian work experience. But very broadly speaking, yes, it is possible for your online remote work to qualify.
Perfect. Next question. I received confirmation of nomination through the skilled worker stream, and now I'm processing via non-express entry. Is this the correct process?
Yes. So if your nomination is under skilled worker, that's not an express entry nomination. That's a regular non-express entry PNP. So sounds like you're on the right track there.
Perfect. So it means that even if I'm paying taxes in New Brunswick, but my employer is not in any of the Atlantic provinces, I'm not eligible for the New Brunswick PNP and AIP, correct?
Yes, that's right. So yeah, you're paying taxes because you're living in New Brunswick, but the employer is not a New Brunswick employer. So you wouldn't be eligible for the PNP or the yeah.
Perfect. Regarding the PNP, New Brunswick, PhD students can apply while studying or are required to complete the graduation.
Yeah, so at the thesis phase, they will start accepting as the student connection for the PNP for students in a master's or PhD.
Mhm. Is a spouse of a PR primary applicant eligible for an open work permit while application is at the federal level awaiting final approval?
Spouse of a PR applicant eligible for an open work permit. Yes. So the short answer is yes. I'd want to understand a bit more about what your status is as the primary applicant as well, but there should be a route for your spouse to apply.
I have been in the New Brunswick PNP Express entry stream for a while. I haven't gotten an ITA. What are the criteria to receive the ITA under this stream? And for how long can one be in the expression of interest pool?
So yeah, you want to make sure that you're meeting one of those connections, those NB connections, if you're going through the express entry PNP. The expression of interest, I believe it's valid for up to a year. Your profile has to be valid at the federal level, and your profile at the federal level is valid for up to a year. So, you know, again, if you're sitting in that pool and you're not getting an invitation, then I would suggest, you know, maybe we have a separate conversation to confirm whether that's the best pathway for you. Maybe if you have employer support or something else, there'd be another pathway you could avail of.
Perfect. Is AIP similar to PNP in that the employee commits to reside in the province and cannot move elsewhere in Canada, given the opportunity?
Yeah, so AIP and PNP, very similar. Both are provincial programs, which means both come with that requirement to demonstrate your intention to settle in the province that is nominating and or endorsing you. So very similar to PNP in that.
What are the flexible healthcare jobs you have mentioned for PNP?
Oh, yeah. Okay. I think that was on one of the other slides there. So let me just see. Maybe we can talk offline. If that person wants to email me, I can send them some additional information on that there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Morgan. Is misrepresentation a fraud or a lie?
So, you know, both, I guess, would be my answer, because misrepresentation is anything that is untrue about your circumstances or could induce an error in the officer who is administering the act or assessing your application. So if it is an outright lie, right? You know, let's just say, for example, one of the background information questions asks, have you ever had an application refused for Canada or any other country? If you have, but you tick no in response to that and say you haven't had that refused, then, you know, that it could be a mistake that you mistakenly ticked no, or it could be intentional that you've said no when the real answer is yes. IRCC doesn't have any way to know whether it was a mistake or intentional. So that's why it's so important for you, and the onus is on you to make sure that you're answering those things correctly, because it will be treated in the same way. Fraud, on the other hand, you know, is more so someone who has submitted fraudulent documents. So they claim that they have work experience and maybe they make up a letter from an employer confirming that work experience, and it's not a real letter, a real employer, or the employer didn't actually write and sign that letter, but they submitted as though they had. Well, that is still a lie, right? Because you're submitting it as if this is a real document, but in fact, it was made up. And so the consequences are the same. You'd still be potentially found to have misrepresented yourself because you have misrepresented yourself by submitting that fraudulent document.
Perfect. Thanks, Morgan. I think there are a few questions here you already answered. Working under a postgraduate work permit, do I need a proof of funds? I think
So-
you did answer that.
Yeah, the proof of funds requirements depend on the PR application that you're submitting, not necessarily the work permit that you hold. For the most part, those who are already working and have a work permit in Canada aren't required to demonstrate proof of funds. You know, that's true for the express entry, that's true for the AIP, for example. You just want to make sure that you're checking the program requirements.
Can I claim husband 1 year work experience in Canada without English test?
So that is an express entry question. Sounds like yes, your spouse would be eligible for points for their 1 year of work experience without necessarily writing an English test themselves. The principal applicant still needs to do the language test, but the spouse wouldn't necessarily have to. Now, if they can get points for the language, it's worth getting those extra points, but it's not mandatory for the spouse.
Do I need an ECA if I graduate from NBCC 1 year certificate?
No, so an ECA is only to assess foreign education. If you have Canadian education, then it's your Canadian diploma and transcript that you would use.
Where can I assess my eligibility for the EE skilled worker?
So there is an online tool to determine your point score. So if you look up the federal skilled worker points system just online, there is a calculator you can go through to estimate your eligibility for the federal skilled worker points, and then also estimate your CRS score, the comprehensive ranking system score as well, which is the score you'll actually get in the pool.
Mm-hmm. Where do you apply for bridging open work permit?
So bridging open work permit is just like any other work permit. You'd submit that application online through your online portal for IRCC, so the MyCIC portal.
Morgan, we still like receiving questions, so I think it's endless.
Yeah.
So I don't want to tie you too much after an hour. So do you still have time, or do you mind if I can collect some questions and send it to you, and then I will forward it to the clients? So what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's probably best, Doa, if you want to kind of collect any, because I think you're right, you know, we could probably carry on for a long time here today. And then, you know, in addition to that, I'll take a look at those, probably be a common theme among some, so we can respond to those. And if people have more specific questions, right, about their individual circumstances, as I noted at the beginning, Doa has my contact information. My law firm, McInnes Cooper, the website has my email and phone number information as well. So please feel free to reach out as well if you'd like to maybe meet with me separately.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Morgan, for this very informative session. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today. And please follow up with me if you have any other questions for further assist. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Doa. Thanks, everyone, for your time. I appreciate you joining us, and nice speaking with you virtually.
Thank you, Morgan. Take care.
Take care.
Bye now.
Dame un segundo.
Bye.